Hi, welcome, and two more welcomes. Welcome to everybody joining us for a continuing series where we talk to reporters, writers, activists, anybody on the left, anybody on the right, as long as they can think clearly and present their thoughts to you. We want to present it to you unedited and unaltered so that you could do this thing that was popular back when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe we'll have a renaissance, maybe we won't. With us today, it is our privilege to have Professor Henry W. Brands. He's the professor of the Jack S. Blanton Senior Chair in History, the University of Texas at Austin. He was born in Portland, Oregon, where he lived until he went to California. Right on. He attended Stanford University, great university, and studied history and mathematics. After graduating, he became a traveling salesman, a territory that spanned the West from the Pacific to Colorado. That was my brother's sales territory for cable sales. His wanderlust diminished after several trips across the Great Basin, and he turned to sales of a different sort, namely teaching. For 9 years, he taught mathematics and history in high school and community college while he resumed his formal education, earning graduate degrees in mathematics and history, concluding with a doctorate in history from the University of Texas at Austin. He also worked as an oral historian at the University of Texas Law School and became a visiting professor of history at Vanderbilt University. He joined the faculty in 1987 at Texas A&M University, where he taught for 17 years. In 2005, he returned to the University of Texas. He has written 30 books, co-authored and edited 5 others, and published dozens of articles and scores of reviews. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the International Herald Tribune, the Boston Globe, the Atlantic Monthly, the Smithsonian, the National Interest, the American Historical Review, the Journal of American History, the Political Science Quarterly, American History, and many other newspapers, magazines, and journals. His writings have received critical and popular acclaim. The First American and Traitor to his class were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize and the Los Angeles Times Prize. Brands is a member of various honorary societies, including the Society of American Historians and the Philosophical Society of Texas. He's also a regular guest on national radio and television programs and is frequently interviewed by the American and foreign press. These are some of the classes that he teaches: American History, 1789 to present, and the United States since 1865. And this is the article where I found the professor. But before we touch on that, let's check in and see how well we did. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Is there something we need to correct with your bio or your background?
No, that sounds fine.
Yep. Okay. Well, let's go right to the meat and potatoes. This article came out in 2018. It's a couple of years ago. How the Supreme Court could fracture the nation and how it threatens to do so again. Abortion and America's new sectional divide. What was going on in 2018, and why was this a relevant topic? Why were you compelled to write the article? And before you answer, if you could talk to me as though I've been in a cave for maybe 5 years. I don't know what was going on in 2018. What was going on in 2018? Why were people upset? Why was this an issue? And why were you compelled to write about it?
In 2018, Donald Trump had been president for almost 2 years. He had been elected in part on his promise to appoint more conservative justices to the Supreme Court. The conservative cause in America since the early 1970s had been trying to undo a Supreme Court decision of that era describing abortion as an individual right, something that the states could not abridge. Conservatives had hoped to overturn that decision, called Roe v. Wade. And with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, they seemed to be on the verge of getting their way. It took a little while for the justices, for Donald Trump to get the appointments they wanted, for the justices to be confirmed. And when they were confirmed, it became apparent that they would weigh in on this question of abortion. Is abortion a right under the U.S. Constitution? And the position of a majority of the justices, as it turned out, was no, it's not. It is a matter for politicians to decide. And by overturning Roe v. Wade, should they do it, then it would cause the question to go back to the states. And where it had been before the Roe v. Wade decision was adjudicated. And so this was the position. And in 2018, this question was still pending. Now, since then, the Supreme Court indeed has overturned Roe v. Wade. And so we live at a time when access to abortion is controlled by state legislatures. Now, At the time I wrote the article, I didn't know this was going to happen, but it seemed as though it might. And if it did, it raised the prospect of causing a split in the United States, a split of a nature that hadn't existed for a long time. I teach history, and a big part of the history that I teach is the Civil War. And the question for anybody studying the 19th century is, what would cause one or more states to choose to leave the Union? What would make them decide that their rights and the rights of their citizens were endangered by remaining within the Union? This had happened. It had been threatened on a number of occasions, starting in the 1790s, when the question was free speech rights and free press rights, and how they were threatened by the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Right.
Thomas Jefferson and James Madison suggested that states might resist federal power in this case by nullifying, and that's the term they used, nullifying the federal law, saying the federal law does not apply in this state. So that was just perspective. The Jefferson Party won the next election, and the laws were allowed to expire. The second challenge to federal law under the Union came during the War of 1812, when several states of New England threatened not only to nullify the law, but to secede from the Union over war powers. They felt that the War of 1812 was not in the interests of New England. The war was against Old England. And they met in Hartford, Connecticut, in a convention that looked a lot like the convention of 1787 in Philadelphia that wrote the Constitution, that basically created a new government. Now, the New England states did not secede in 1814, but the idea was out there in the early 1830s. South Carolina threatened to secede from the Union over a tax bill that it didn't like. So these challenges to the Union, where states were saying, we don't know if our rights are secured in the Union. It might be time for us to leave. It finally came to a head after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. This is the one Americans remember because it gave rise to the Civil War. But the idea of secession and the question, do states feel that their rights are secure under the existing Constitution and its interpretation by the federal government? It came to a head and it led to the Civil War. And it seemed as though that settled the issue. 11 southern states seceded, proclaimed that they were no longer part of the Union. The Civil War was fought, and the seceding states were compelled to return to the Union. Now, it's worth noting that they lost on the battlefield. The southern states, the secessionists, did not feel they had lost the argument. They believed the argument was just as valid as it had been before, but nobody wanted to press the issue. And so for 100 years, for almost 150 years, no state has said, we're no longer part of the Union, we might leave, we might get out of here. And until the 1980s or 1990s, there was no issue that so polarized the American people as to raise this question. Yeah, I live in Texas, and some Texans, real fringe Texans, talk sort of fondly, but historically ignorantly, about the great times when Texas was a republic, a country of its own during the 1830s and 1840s. I have to point out to them, this was not Texas's decision. Texas wanted to join the Union, but the U.S. said, no, we don't want you. Eventually, this was worked out, and Texas entered the Union. But in the late 20th century, in the early 21st centuries, politics became more polarized. And as the lightning rod issue came to be abortion, it came to look as though, well, the lessons of the early 19th century, where states might say our rights are no longer safe within the Union, might return. And more people talked about, well, this federal government isn't working for us. Originally, it was conservatives who said that. But after the conservative shift in American politics, really starting with Ronald Reagan, but culminating with the election of Donald Trump, and then with the conservative control of the Supreme Court, I thought that we might, I never said we would, I said I hope we don't, but I said it's possible that certain states might decide if abortion is not considered a constitutional right, then maybe we no longer belong within the Union. Now, there was something else that was going to happen to bring this to a head. And it was that the Anti-abortion forces, heartened by an overturning of Roe v. Wade, would have to go beyond that. And here I'll point out they have not gone beyond that. But my scenario was, after having removed abortion rights from the Constitution under the interpretation of the Supreme Court, they would go beyond that, because overturning Roe v. Wade simply sent abortion back to the states. And the states can say more restrictive abortion laws, less restrictive abortion laws. But the same people who are opposed to abortion might very well say, okay, if it's not a constitutional right, then we can make a federal abortion law, and we can write a very restrictive federal abortion law. Now, I'll note for your audience that this has not happened, but it still could. There still are some people who are opposed to, very, very strongly opposed to abortion, and who deeply feel that abortion is murder, who want to make it a federal crime. Now, if that should happen, then people living in liberal states, where a majority is in favor of more relaxed abortion laws, might very well say, as people said at various times leading up to the Civil War, our rights are no longer secure within the Union. And they might say, you know what, maybe we should leave the Union. Now, at the very least, if there were a federal anti-abortion law, it would be tempting for liberal states. I'll start with California, because under my scenario, this is the most likely one. California is big enough. It has enough people. It has a strong enough economy that it is a perfectly plausible independent country. If Delaware wanted to secede, Delaware is not big enough that it could make it as its own country. But California could, especially if California started talking about secession. Then Oregon and Washington quite likely would follow along. So there could be this Pacific Coast Republic. Anyway, so that was the scenario. That's how it could play out. It has not played out. We've gone halfway there. So abortion now is no longer a constitutional right, according to the Supreme Court. There are people saying there ought to be a federal, stronger anti-abortion law. That hasn't taken hold. And that doesn't seem to be in the cards anytime soon. But that's the scenario.
So the Supreme Court has decided that abortion is not a constitutional right, which sets the stage that people could come around in the future and say, well, we're going to deny the right of abortion to people then, since it's not a guaranteed right. Is that right? Accurate?
And the thing is, and since this has to do with the United States, this scenario would require a federal law saying that people in California cannot exercise what they consider to be their abortion rights the way they want to.
Right.
As long as there's no federal law, then there's no pressure for secession, because California can write its own abortion laws. And so there's no incentive for California to leave the Union on that issue.
So as long as there is no federal law, everything's fine.
Yeah, at least, well, I'll put it this way. That issue will not be an incentive to leave the Union.
Okay.
Now, I mean, there might be other issues, and it probably would not be a single issue. There would be a feeling, though, that the federal government no longer works for us. For example, if there should be another federal election for president in which the Democratic candidate wins a majority of the popular vote, but loses the electoral vote, which has happened recently,
right,
then Democrats might say, we keep electing Democrats, but we get denied the presidency because of our attachment to the Constitution. This document that was written almost 250 years ago, and nothing is forever. Nothing lasts forever. And so if it doesn't work for us, if you believe in self-government, then the advocates of, let's say, California secession might very well say, this isn't self-government. We want this one thing, and we're consistently not getting it. So it has to be more than one issue, and it has to be more than one moment, because people are willing to put up with something. But and most people see a value to the Union. I should add, though, that I've been talking about secession by liberals. And this is the harder case because liberals are inclined to be more respectful of the union of government generally. Now, if, for example, the table should be turned and the Democrats should gain control, let's say, of both houses of Congress and the presidency, and this should last long enough that the Supreme Court would tip again in a liberal direction, then a scenario whereby conservative states might be tempted to leave the Union. There it becomes somewhat more problematic geographically because California is an easy exit. It's got its own seacoast, it's got its own seaports, it has its own access to the world. If Kansas wanted to secede, and if it were Kansas by itself, it'd be surrounded by foreign territory. However, Texas could secede. Much of the South is conservative. So the South, not necessarily the same states that seceded in the 1860s, might decide they'd leave. Texas is nearly as big as California. Texas would be a viable independent country. And Texas is full of conservatives who don't like government anyway, and they especially don't like the federal government.
I want to back up some of the things you said. After Roe v. Wade was overturned, you had someone called Mike Pence, who's the vice president, and he said, not good enough. Let's have a national abortion ban. And he was backed up by Republicans. I found that dismaying because the Republican Party had, I don't know, the last 70 to 100 years said they're the party of federalism.
Yeah.
And then when the Supreme Court gives the decision back to the states, Mike Pence says, not good enough, let's overdo it. Basically slapping the idea of federalism in the face. I thought, wow, you guys really just backlashed against something you said you were all about at an existential level for the last century, but whatever.
Well, we can't insist on too much consistency among politicians. So
I just thought that's like liberals saying one day climate change is fake and we lied the whole time. I mean, it's such an about face to their philosophy.
Well, except, I mean, liberals are comfortable with more government, except if it restricts their abortion rights.
Sure.
So it really goes down issue by issue. And consistency is too much to ask for in politicians.
Fair enough. I do want to back up your other things. When Donald Trump was elected, California did try to secede. There was the Cal Exit movement. They had 32% of the states say they wanted to secede right now, and 47.5%, almost half, said they were willing to talk about secession, according to Reuters, Ipsos, and Stanford University Press. Additionally, during the time of COVID, you did have Governor Newsom said nation state, nation state, nation state in an interview with Rachel Maddow, and then announced a coalition with other West Coast states where they were going to ignore whatever the federal government said about COVID and do their own thing.
Well, this is the first step, and it goes back to Jefferson. The first thing you do is you ignore federal law, and nullification means ignoring federal law as it applies to your state. Yeah, and I should point out that this ignoring federal law takes all sorts of forms. There are a number of cities that call themselves sanctuary cities, where they refuse to enforce federal immigration laws. They refuse to ask the immigration status of people who apply for city services. There's that. There are several states that ignore federal laws against cannabis. Cannabis is still illegal under federal law, but in California, Colorado, and several other states, you can use it, buy it, and sell it perfectly legally. So this idea of picking and choosing among the federal laws you want to acknowledge and enforce, it's still with us.
So these are all examples. So I'm here in California, and nullification means ignoring federal law. We do sanctuary cities here in California, don't care what the federal government says about immigration. In fact, our governor said on Spanish American television, I believe in Honduras, consider us having a separate immigration policy than America. That's pretty bold. Also, we ignored cannabis laws for many years. We didn't care what Obama said. We did our own thing. And then we also ignored federal guidance on COVID-19. Those are all examples of nullification. Is nullification the same thing as secession? Is it in the family of secession, or is it radically and totally different than secession and you can't compare them at all?
No, it's related. It's a step toward secession, because what motivates states to decide to leave the Union is they feel that they're being required to do something that is not in their interests. And the first step is to say, we're simply not going to do that thing. Whether it's South Carolina saying, we're not going to pay that tariff that we don't like, or it's when Jefferson and Madison say that the states of Virginia and Kentucky are not going to enforce the Alien and Sedition Acts of the 1790s. But then the question comes, what if the federal government says, you are going to enforce that and we're going to make you do it? This is what Andrew Jackson did to South Carolina in the 1830s. He asked Congress for authorization to raise an army to go into South Carolina and compel South Carolina to enforce that law. Now, South Carolina backed down, Jackson backed off a little bit, and a compromise was established. But if nullification is not allowed, if the federal government says you must enforce this law, then that's when states say, well, wait a minute, okay, we're simply going to leave the Union. We'll be a separate country, and then you can't make us do it.
Interesting.
Now, I have to add an important caveat here.
Yeah.
In the earlier times, in the 18th century and the 19th century, the connections between the federal government and the states were many fewer than they are today. It would be horribly wrenching for California to leave the United States today, by comparison with when Texas tried to leave the Union in the 1860s. Because in the 1860s, the connections between states and their residents and the federal government were very few. Texans, they participated in the federal government when they sent a letter. So the post office was the principal connection of individuals in states to the federal government. But there were no social security systems. There was no defense spending. There was no federal investment in scientific research. There was no federal money for roads. There was no federal operation of airports or anything like that. So leaving the Union would be a much bigger deal today than it would have been had it succeeded in the 1860s. But having said that, Brexit, and Britain decided to leave the European Union, and that was a big wrench. And they did it just within the last decade.
Right. That's a good point. A lot of people said Brexit would never happen. And then they said if Brexit happened, England would fall into the ocean and its economy would collapse and the moon would crash into it. None of that happened. I understand they had a tough time. I understand their currency took a hit. But people were talking about the collapse of the British pound and the collapse of the government. Never happened. They actually pulled it off, defied the predictions, and they're still around.
Well, they did pull it off. By most measures, the British economy is smaller than it would have been. As a result of this, and Britain's probably poorer. And if they were to redo the referendum today, it would probably lose. Possibly.
There was some dirty tricks, possibly. I remember the amount of money that England was going to get back by not subsidizing other people's was massively inflated, and some people weren't happy about that. Yeah. At the same time, the prediction when Brexit happened was total collapse.
Right.
That never happened. And I saw lots. I studied foreign policy. I saw all sorts of professors and experts saying guaranteed, never happened. Yeah. So that is kind of an interesting point. You can defy expectations sometimes and survive.
Well, and a question that I pose to my students: if California said we're leaving the Union, would this be followed by a war? Do Americans today have the same, what do I call it, proprietary devotion to the Union that they had in the 1860s? Is leaving something as big a deal today? To give you a simple, prosaic, and maybe not entirely applicable comparison, nobody got divorced in the 1860s. Divorce was essentially impossible. But now people get divorced all the time. And many people liken secession to divorce. Well, Okay, there's no fault divorce in California and every other state in the country these days. So the other thing is that a war in the 1860s within, call it sort of the ordinary, understandable capacity of people, because wars were one guy shoots at another guy, and that's it. And so wars weren't so much beyond the ordinary life of people as they are today. So would the United States, would the Army of the United States, the Air Force of the United States, launch attacks against California? Would F-16s bomb Sacramento? It's kind of, would the federal government threaten the use of nuclear weapons against Los Angeles? It's really hard to imagine that happening. One last thing on this. In the 19th century, the middle of the 18th century, was a time when nationalism meant putting smaller pieces together to make bigger countries. So Italy was unified in the 19th century.
Right.
Germany was unified in the 19th century.
Yeah.
The United States was unified in the 19th
Right.
century. Nowadays, nationalism refers to people wanting to separate. And so Quebec wants to separate from Canada, and some of the Western provinces of Canada want to split off. And Catalonia wants to split off from Spain. And Scotland wants to split off from the UK. And Britain split off from the EU. And none of those led to civil wars, major
Right.
wars. So I don't know if the world has the stomach for trying to hold a big group of people together with another group of people against their will, at least in, call it, the liberal Western world. If Xinjiang tried to get away from China, yeah, there would be a war there.
Sure.
And we'll find out if Taiwan wants to get out of China's sphere, whether there's going to be a war there. But I don't know. I don't have an answer to this question. I pose it to audiences, and some say, yeah, we'd fight to keep, we're not going to let California go. But a lot of other people, I put it to my students, and they say, whatever.
I find that surprising because I'm half Mexican, and the Mexican half is actually Tejano, the original Mexicans in Texas before we were taken over, and then they were forced to become Texans against their own will. And I'm like third or fourth generation. So the interesting thing is that I can compare the culture there to here, and I have noticed that my relatives in Texas and everybody there don't like Californians. I've seen a lot of articles about why the hell are Californians here. I remember there was an article about in Oregon. California moved up to Oregon. They spray painted on his car, go back to California. Also did that in Washington. Also did that in Colorado. Also did that in Wyoming. So there's a lot of places where Californian states are actively saying, get the hell out. You also had the Nevada governor's election where one of the candidates ran on, don't turn Nevada into California. I think it was the last Texas governor, Abbott, also talked about don't California-cate my Texas. So you have people running on, I don't want to be California. You have multiple states talking about, I hate Californians. The Republican Party under Trump, I think the last Republican Party convention under Trump was don't be California was the theme, with more speeches about how California sucks and is horrible. And when I asked historians, nobody could name another time in all of American history where one or two parties said, our whole platform is picking on one specific state and saying how they're horrible and not like the rest of us. So you can also look at Fox News polls. 80% of Americans in those hate California. Movoto Real Estate did a poll. There's also polls on the least liked state in America. I think out of 2016, it's California. So there's a lot of polls,
But if you looked at other sections, if you went to New England, they wouldn't say that California is a state they dislike most. They would say Texas.
Sure.
If you go to Colorado,
sure,
they don't like the Texans coming in.
Sure.
So,
sure. But if you look at a majority of the polls from basically 2012 to now, California overwhelmingly and by far compared to all other states comes up as the most hated in most polls. There was a TikTok channel the other day on just we hate Californians. And we've never had a Republican Party talk about Connecticut or Wyoming. We've never had a president outline, you are the enemy. Yeah, he focused on New York, but there was a lot of hate directly at us. I think he said California is out of control. So there's a lot of evidence of direct, specific hate directed at California. And I'm wondering if we couldn't get out. I mean, if it was actually up to a vote, and I understand people in New York wouldn't want to see us go, and maybe Chicago, but if it sounds like the majority of the country does. And I'd like to point out this quote here by Danny Savalos. He's the legal analyst for MSNBC and NBC News. When Calexit was popular, he wrote this article in 2016 on November 11th, and he is the legal analyst for 2 different liberal networks. The reality is that if California really wanted to, it could probably just leave the United States. It would be an unconstitutional legal act, but what would Washington actually do about it? Post another announcement on the White House webpage saying it doesn't approve? That was Danny Savalas, legal analyst for MSNBC and NBC News, said they probably won't do anything. How do you feel about that? Is that possible if California said, hey, you're taking away our abortion rights. You're pushing a federal law saying you're going to take away our abortion rights. We want to leave. I think you're saying it's an open question. Not sure if Americans would like that or not.
I think it's an open question. Here I will point out that who happens to be president at the time will have a great deal of influence. And the reason I say that is that if polls had been taken in the United States in 1861, should there be a war to keep the South in the Union, the polls probably would have said no. In fact, the abolitionists were the ones who had been arguing in favor of Northern secession from the South,
right?
Because they didn't want to be held responsible for slavery.
Right.
So, but Abraham Lincoln said, I'm not going to let this happen. If Lincoln had taken the same position that his predecessor, James Buchanan, who was actually president when the South seceded, Buchanan's position was, this is unconstitutional. You don't have a right to do it, but I don't have the power to prevent it. And so if Buchanan had remained in office, it would have happened. So if there's a president who is perhaps a Californian himself or herself at the time who says, we're not letting California go, that president could help frame the question in a way that it would make it difficult. Now,
sure,
if California did leave, there would be a lot of negotiations over who gets what. So there's a lot of federal land in California. Who gets Yosemite Park?
Yeah.
Who gets all the military bases in California?
Sure.
And California has claims on the national government. So all those residents of California who've been paying their Social Security taxes, who's going to pay their pensions if California leaves? Now, when Britain left the EU, they had this big deal where they just hammered it all out. And each side came up with this number. This is what we think our assets are, our claims are, this is what our liabilities are, and we'll work it out. So if the political situation, if the political moment were such where the national government says we're not going to fight over it, we're not going to resist secession, then something would be worked out. It might take years to decide exactly what, and nobody would be entirely happy, but that's in the nature of divorce. Nobody's happy.
True. 50% of the land in California is owned by the federal government. It's among the highest in America. About 40 states only have 10% of the land. And then when you get to the western half, it's about half of our states. A lot of people said that's unconstitutional and not fair, but whatever, who can say. I would point out, though, that most of the land that's owned by the federal government is the Sierra Nevada mountains, again, that are between California. That was the place of an official genocide in 1850. The United Nations has this habit of saying if you committed a genocide to take over land, you don't really have a strong claim to it. So I think if we were actually going to talk about who the land belongs to, we'd have to talk about the official genocide of 1850, which is well documented. There's receipts, there's stamps for Native American heads paid for by the California government, which was populated by American officials. And that might come into play on who gets the land, because those Native tribes are still here, and they could still launch lawsuits. And we've also seen where the Navajo and the Apache have done that in order to legally get some of the land. So that might be more complicated. As far as Social Security,
I would add here, though, the claims would be made against the state of California or the new nation of California, not against the United States, because most of that campaign was done on the authority of California itself.
So there, you could say that there would be an argument that the election of California to be a state was not fair and should not be counted because people.
So if you want to cast into doubt the legitimacy of California as a state, yeah, that opens it up further.
Right. Well,
okay.
Just for everybody's edification, if you were Black or Asian or Latin or Native, you didn't get a vote. The UN outright disregards that. Only white people got a vote. There was a couple rich Spaniards who did. They outright disregarded a lot of people who were not white because they were not white. The UN doesn't typically hold that up in high regards. So yeah, we could look at that. And then the first people who came here and actually enacted the genocide were not people who lived in California. They were Americans who were here 2 years. They got bussed in on the Transcontinental Railroad, took over the government, and then started enacting these things. So we're not actually talking about people who were in California and lived here and loved the place. We're talking about immigrants who came in very quickly and then said, let's commit a genocide and take gold. It could be legally questionable. The other question was Social Security. Under federal law, as long as you are a U.S. citizen, your Social Security check and a lot of your federal benefits go to you. So if California...
If 40 million Americans left via secession, I suspect that law would be revised.
Fair enough. But that's...
And Medicare is not available to people who live outside the United States.
Fair enough. There are a lot of federal benefits that are, as long as you don't renounce your U.S. citizenship. And California is a donor state, so it loses absolutely nothing leaving the United States. In fact, it pays more into the U.S. government, so there'd be no loss of money in any capacity once we left because we pay more in, and have done so for the last 4 years.
That's what the advocates of Brexit said. So it's one thing if you just look at cash flows, but if you look at ownership of land, for example, and all that other stuff. And so, for example, faculty at the University of California and Stanford and everywhere else who get federal money, all of a sudden they're cut out of this. And researchers at British universities are finding exactly this situation.
So, yeah, but that's because Brexit lied about the financial differences that they had and how much they would gain. And the Calexit people were not. It's well established. It goes back to Governor Schwarzenegger. There's been a legislative analyst office review of this. This is 30 to 40 years documented that we get about 79 cents, 75 cents. Some years are different, like COVID-19, but we're basically losing 16 to 30 billion dollars every year being part of the U.S. government. So you cut that federal funding, fine. It's replaced by California money by 2 times as much. That's what it means to be a donor state. We feed these other states. I always get upset when I see the governor of Florida talk about how California businesses should leave California because their tax rates are so horrible and because they appreciate businesses and have low taxes in Florida. That's because Florida gets a $1 to $3 ratio. They get money from us so they don't have to have higher taxes, and then they complain about us when they take our money. That's kind of silly, right?
Well, one of the things that would likely happen, it wouldn't happen at once, but it would happen over time, is that the big Silicon Valley firms would move to Texas because they wouldn't be guaranteed access to the U.S. market if they're in a foreign country.
I have talked to some professors about that who were economists, and they said basically the way the earth is going is world trade, and nobody would agree to not trading with each other. So America says we're not going to trade with California. You lose economically. It's not just California. Everybody who doesn't trade loses economically.
Exactly the same argument applies to U.S. trade with China. And
fair enough.
2/3 of the people in the United States say we ought to trade less with China.
Fair enough, but nobody was willing to start the trade war with China until Trump came along. He was the only person crazy enough to actually enact it. Nobody was willing to do that before then.
And the Biden administration has declined to
undo it. Thank you. The Biden administration has kept it up, absolutely, and that's a big cause of inflation. People may not do that because they may recognize that what Biden did helped cause inflation and ruin living standards for Americans. It's neither here nor there. How do we get out of this? How do we have a less polarized America where, so if the federal government says nobody gets to have the right of abortions, we could see things getting really bad. Let's say that never happens, but we still are in a January 6th could happen at every moment type level of polarization. Professor, how do we reduce this to a workable level where Americans don't hate each other so much and aren't as interested in, well, if your guy wins, I'm just going to leave the union? How do we get to where that's not a common thought?
So the big question for any observer of the presidency of American politics is Donald Trump idiosyncratic, or is he a portent of the future?
Thank
Is
you.
this a new model, or is this just a one-time exemption from the old rules that applies to Trump?
Thank you.
And once he's off the scene, then things revert to their normal, somewhat more civil discourse. We live at a time, it really started in the 1990s with Newt Gingrich and his contract with America, when the two sides began waging war against each other. It was facilitated by the rise of cable television, so you got to choose your own network: conservative, Fox News; liberal, MSNBC. It was facilitated by social media, so you can stay in your cocoon the whole time. You don't have to communicate with other people. But it reached the apex of American politics with Donald Trump, who essentially waged this permanent campaign and it was striking with Trump. When he became president, he did not do what previous presidents all had done. Even if they won close races, bitter races, on Inauguration Day, they said, okay, now we are all Americans, let's pull together. But Trump continued his campaign of vilification of everybody else. The result of this was that he lost control of Congress. He lost for re-election. His base is not expanded at all. And so other Republicans have been watching this. And occasionally Republicans still say we ought to federalize restrictions on abortion, but Republicans in Congress are in no hurry to do this because they realize how unpopular abortion has made them in many states. And this is one of the principal reasons they lost ground in the last congressional election. And most Republicans who are thinking of their own future, am I going to get reelected? Am I going to be thrown out? They don't want to push this too hard because they realize they've already been pushed farther than they want to, but until now they can blame it on the Supreme Court. But if they do it themselves, then members of Congress are going to be required to vote yes or no for this new restriction. And everyone who votes yes for the new restriction is going to realize, I've got a target on my back, because that's not where the opinion, the consensus of the country lies. Poll after poll demonstrates that most Americans, up to 70%, want abortion laws that are sharply restrictive in the third trimester, but are pretty liberal up until then. Most Americans do not buy into the idea that abortion is always murder. And so we've got a Supreme Court that has taken that position, but the Supreme Court so far has only said, okay, you can't claim it as a constitutional right. Now it's up to the states. And some of the states have drawn really restrictive rules. And even there, some of the states, Texas, it's causing problems. There's going to be a backlash. So how will we get out of this? The first thing is to remember that Donald Trump will not live forever. I don't know if he's going to get the Republican nomination next year, probably. Will he win or lose? I don't know, one way or the other, but he's not going to live forever. And will there be somebody come along like Donald Trump who continues to rail against the government, continues to wage political war? If the answer is yes, then I'm not sure how to undo this, because it will be interpreted as this is the way you win in politics. Politicians, like everybody else, respond to incentives. And if it works, they do it again. If it doesn't work, they don't. So I don't expect that there will ever be a time when Americans love each other, like each other. I've got a new book coming out just in a few weeks on partisan politics in the 1790s. We've had politics since then. It's called Founding Partisans, and political parties emerged from the beginning. And the partisan rhetoric was as bitter in the 1790s as it is today. In that early period, people shot and killed each other in duels that originated in politics. We haven't seen that. So This country has done a good job of sort of stumbling through. It's very rarely been pretty, but it's always worked up to a point. And with the exception of the Civil War, a huge exception, no question about it, every time a state started saying, it'd probably be better off outside the Union, they calm down, something happens, they say, let's just stick around, let's just stick with what we've got. I should mention something, and this is one of the principal reasons that Abraham Lincoln refused to let the South go. Because he said, if you think we've got problems between North and South when we're part of the same country, wait and see what happens when we're different countries. Lincoln predicted that there would be a war between North and South, whether the South were an independent country or not. He preferred sort of to keep it as an insurrection. But Lincoln predicted, and I think he was right, if the South had left the Union, it wouldn't have gone 10 years or 20 years before there would have been a war, an international war between North and South. If California leaves the Union, then who's California going to ally with? Well, its natural trading partner is China. Is China going to form an alliance? Is California forming an alliance with China against the United States? Would the United States allow that to happen?
It would never happen. Nor would
if you leave the Union, all of a sudden you are a potential enemy. California leaving the Union is necessarily going to wind up like Canada. The reason Canada is Canada is very weak compared to the United States, and the Canadians have always known it. If California leaves the Union, they'll be full of themselves. Say, you can't push us around.
Yeah, but that's different than saying they want to leave the Western order. Even when England left the EU, it didn't say, I want to tie myself to Russia and China and ignore Western values and not really be connected to Europe. It's Californians speak American-style English. The idea that we would say, let's tie ourselves to China and not America, I find that difficult to see. I did want to point out that Lincoln said you cannot unilaterally secede. In his first inaugural address, he did allow for a form of secession if the people consented. So if the public told him and there was a legitimate vote, you could do that. That was confirmed by Salmon Chase, the Supreme Court justice he personally appointed, and the Supreme Court case Texas versus White that said you could secede with consent. Salmon Chase based that on Lincoln's first inaugural address. But it did say
with the consent of Congress.
Absolutely. Well, it said consent to states, to people. It's not
No. It's not up to the state. It's up to Congress. Congress has to approve that these states are going to leave the Union. And that's never going to happen. Congress isn't going to vote to let California leave the Union. And
that was not defined. Okay. That was not defined in Lincoln's first inaugural or in the Supreme Court case.
No, what Lincoln said was that, yes, the South has a right to self-government, but it's a revolutionary right, not a constitutional right. So they're wrong in thinking the Constitution allows secession. They are right in saying that they can stage a revolution, just like the American colonies in the 1770s had no right under British law to leave the Union. And they didn't claim that they did. They claimed they had a right under natural law, a revolutionary right. So Lincoln said to the South, okay, you're launching a revolution. Well, a revolution involves, you got to win the war. And if you win the war, then you will be independent. But I'm not going to let you win the war if I can prevent it. Ulysses Grant, the commanding general of the Union forces, had said the same thing. He said, if you believe in self-government, a people have a right to govern themselves, but they can't claim that right under the U.S. Constitution. They have to claim it outside the Constitution. And Lincoln and Grant were involved in enforcing the Constitution. If you can beat us, then you win. You get your way.
That is what they said in the Salmon Chase said in that Texas versus White. You could, through revolution or through consent to the states. Consent was not defined, so it's open. Erwin Chemerinsky, the top constitutional scholar in all of America, said it's not clear exactly what it means. If it means the people or the states or whatever. Lincoln said you couldn't secede unilaterally. He left it open for the public. Chase backed that up in Texas versus White. And the always interesting thing for me with the Civil War is that it wasn't really the boundary lines that we think of today until after the South attacked Fort Sumter, and then after Lincoln started raising an army to go defend it. Then you had other states joining in and you really started seeing the boundaries of the civil war as we know. So I think people started shooting at each other, seems, before it really got super serious. How do we, can we have, so I loved what you were saying about the problem is, what if someone comes up after Trump and they're able to speak like Trump or to Trump's base? That might mean that Trumpism continues. Would Ron DeSantis be an example of that?
We've seen what Ron DeSantis does as governor of Florida. What would he do as president of the United States?
Right.
I don't know. It's hard to tell. Candidates say certain things as candidates, then they become president. One of the striking things about Donald Trump, and you got to give him credit for this, is consistency. In fact, it's much more common for candidates to say what they want they think voters want to hear, and then they become president, and all of a sudden they're saying and doing something quite different. Trump has been consistent in that regard.
True. The debate I had with fellow liberals was, their idea was, oh, let's get rid of Trump, and then everything's perfect. And I go, so Mike Pence becomes president? Mike Pence disagreed with none of Trump's policies. Maybe he didn't say horrible things, but he didn't say, I'm disgusted by a border wall and let's make sure to let as many immigrants in. He never disagreed with Trump on policy. So I'm like, it's better we get a guy in who agrees with all of Trump's policies and has the experience and connections to make them happen than that we have Trump who can't make it happen. Is just me.
Right. So the critical issue is, does the Republican Party abandon this idea of denying the outcome of elections?
Right.
The basic rule of democracy is you agree to abide by the voters' verdict.
Right.
And sometimes there have been irregular elections in American history, but the appropriate response to losing the election is not to say we didn't lose the election, it's to say we're going to win the next one. Because the critical thing is to keep the system going, to keep this experiment in self-government going. And one of the disadvantages that our generation lives under is that the Union, American democracy, has been around so long, it's tempted to think it will always be around. And that there was something inevitable about the emergence of American democracy. Well, there was nothing inevitable at all. People had to make decisions to keep the experiment going. And people had to say, okay, it's more important that we have another election under this Constitution than that we win this one. And so if this rash of this epidemic of election denying, that's got to go away. Otherwise, we're never going to get back anywhere near to normal.
So election denying is a problem. I know, obviously, Stop the Steal, January 6th, all bad. Biden won the election, of course. There's this person called Hillary Clinton. And then there's this report called the Durham Report. Have you heard of the Durham Report?
Refresh my memory, please.
So the Durham Report came out a few months ago. And what it basically said was that Hillary Clinton lied about Donald Trump working in collusion with the Russian government. She paid someone to create the Steele dossier. It was not double-checked. Then she said it was factually checked, passed it to the FBI. The FBI abused the FISA warrant process. And basically, you had the FBI intelligence services and Clinton all pushing this lie when they knew there wasn't enough to push it. That's on the official Justice Department website. It's called the Durham Report. CNN itself even backed it up. And basically what they said was that for the 3 years that Hillary Clinton was saying Trump wasn't really president, Russia made him president, that's not true. That was a lie too. And yet we can't seem to get her to acknowledge that. That's not good, right?
No, that's not good at all. I would parse that a little bit differently. I think Hillary Clinton said that Trump doesn't deserve to be president. Mm-hmm. I don't think she said he didn't win the election. She didn't contest the outcome of the election itself. She didn't say he didn't get as many votes as he claims to have gotten. He didn't get as many electoral votes as he claimed to have gotten. What she said is that he was assisted by the Russians and he shouldn't have had that assistance. And that's a different thing. It's one thing to say that candidates lied, candidates exaggerated, but to say that the vote result was actually different than the vote result actually was, that's a different matter. You can't stop candidates from exaggerating. You can't stop people from saying things they think they can get away with. But to reject the actual evidence of what the votes were, that's a line you can't cross. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart.
Hillary Clinton said for years Russia made Trump president. I mean, we
Okay.
can get into the details, but she said, here's the copy of the Durham report on the official Justice Department webpage. And basically what they proved was that Trump never colluded with Russia. He was a nasty guy. And he did ask Putin for help live on television with covering up dirt, but there was no official collusion. She said there was. That was not true. She also said that Russia rigged the election. They show that it's less than 1% effect. That's nowhere near what the intelligence agencies were saying.
Right.
There's the official report.
Right.
So let me ask you this. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third person and they're watching this interview. And they've seen a lot of interesting things they didn't know. A lot of good back and forth, a lot of good takes, a lot of insightful messages they hadn't heard before. But they're struggling to remember what this whole interview was about. But they remember this one thing that the professor said. And it's 5 days after they've watched this interview. And they can't get that one thought out of their head when they think about this interview. What is that one thought you want a random person you'll never meet to not be able to stop thinking about after they're done watching this?
Marcus, I'm afraid I'm the wrong person to answer this question.
Oh, come on.
I think that everything I say is a gem. And it's going to be etched in the memories of the entire audience. No, I would say it's probably this, that if you're going to hold the country together against the various divisive forces we have and have had over time, you have to get people to buy into the idea of the union. And there is something here that has made the United States the wealthiest, the most powerful, arguably the most equal country in world history. So it really works. Mess around with this at your peril.
Maybe it's not perfect. Maybe it has some warts, but messing around with this is like thinking, hey, I have no surgical background. I'll just go ahead and try open heart surgery.
Exactly.
So I understand it's not perfect. I understand it's problematic, but if you think you're going to start going in there, that's like thinking, hey, grandma, I'll do open heart surgery for you. You don't have to go to Kaiser. We shouldn't be thinking that. We shouldn't be thinking it'd be so easy to rip this apart and redesign it better, and that we could do, and we shouldn't be so quick to come to the assumption that we could do better than the founding fathers. Is that fair?
Yep. Okay. America is a work in progress. It always has been and always will be.
That's brilliant. We'll leave it there. I want to say thank you for your time. Thank you for coming out, and thank you for being honest. I loved having a conversation. Would you ever be willing to come back?
Sure.
Awesome. Yeah. I will email you in a little bit a copy of the video, and I want to say thank you, Professor. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for your time, and thank you for spending time looking into polarization in America. I think it's a big, important topic, and I think we need more thinkers looking at it, and I appreciate your efforts.
My pleasure. Good to talk to you.
I'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.